The Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy.
Hello, you're listening to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. My name is Josh Edison in Auckland, New Zealand. His name is Ian Dentith in Bucharest, Romania. That is where you are at the
Hello!
moment. Is it? Yes.
I am.
Yes.
I am currently in Bucharest, Romania. I wasn't yesterday,
No.
but I am today.
You've been pinging around Europe like some sort of European pinball. I assume they have pinball in Europe, so it's probably just a pinball.
I'm trying not to start singing Pinball Wizard now.
What? Oh, The Who. Yes, Tommy. How does he do it? How do the words go? I don't care, actually. It's not relevant. What is relevant? What is relevant?
But much of what we say is not relevant. That I'm assuming the only reason why people listen to this podcast is either because they're really patient about us getting to talking about conspiracy theories, or actually they really are quite fond of the irrelevancies that we engage in during the podcast. And so either way, we are appeasing our audience by not being relevant at all times.
Or possibly they have some sort of weird, stalkery, potentially sexual fixation with us, and will just tune in to anything simply to hear the sounds of our voices.
It is true. In the early days, people were full of high praise for your sonorous tones.
Were they? Huh.
Yeah. I mean, one person.
Right.
One person. But still, we get so little listener feedback that one person is kind of a high watermark for the quality of our production, and we've just never been able to beat that. At one point in time, people were listening to this podcast. Well, a person was listening to this podcast to listen to your beautiful voice.
Oh, well, who am I to deny them? Shall we crack on to the news?
I think we should crack on to the news.
Righto.
Breaking conspiracy theories in the news.
So, we start with an update. Actually, sorry. Hold on. I believe you just came back from a trip to Sofia?
Nobody died.
But I assumed you went there for a conference.
I really don't know why you're bringing this up.
The trip to Sofia?
The murders, the ones I definitely did not do.
I didn't mention any murders.
Josh, I'm feeling very pressured and put upon here, and I'd like you to not bring up the 3 mysterious deaths in Sofia where the victims were found with stuffed kiwis inside of their bodies. I really don't see the salience between the fact I was in Sofia at the time and that there were no other New Zealanders in the region.
Okay.
Furthermore, I happen to know there was an Australian in Bulgaria at the time, so there's your likely suspect.
Okay, well, moving on, I guess. An update on whether the New Zealand Defence Force is spying on or collecting data about New Zealand citizens via vampire Lord Peter Thiel's company Palantir.
They are not.
Well, that's a relief.
Well, I guess it is. Matt Nippert, crusading Kiwi journalist, asked the NZDF who, after taking more time than needed for a simple no, said they weren't collecting or analysing the data of New Zealanders, which closes off one conspiracy theory about the whole dodgy deal, but still leaves open the question of what sensitive information Thiel's company is meant to be processing for the New Zealand Defence Force.
But enough about vampires. What about some science?
Science. The Atlantic recently published a very interesting article entitled, "Was There a Civilization on Earth Before Humans?", which summarizes a recent research article by Adam Frank and NASA's Gavin Schmidt on what evidence, if any, would exist for a civilization just like ours from several million years ago. It's an interesting piece because the starting place was, how would we detect an alien civilization? But the more interesting question turned out to be, how could we know about an earlier alien to us civilization on our own planet Earth.
Now, this turns out to be interesting to those of us interested in conspiracy theories, because the various theories which talk about earlier global super-civilizations of humans face the same evidential issues. Yes, cities and buildings disappear, we build far less permanent superstructures than many of the ancient cultures did, but the geological and environmental remnants of our civilization will prove to be a permanent marker if you know what you're looking for.
Which is a problem for theories like the Celtic super-civilization hypothesis, because in researching human prehistory, we're just not finding the environmental or geological evidence we should expect to find should those civilizations have existed.
Which is kind of interesting, although I'm still worried about the super-civilization of skeletons that we know did exist, given we keep finding skeletal remains everywhere on Earth. I mean, there's a skeleton in each one of us, just waiting to get out. Surely we're doomed.
Which means maybe the following story isn't worth bothering about, but we'll press on regardless.
Yes. Now, a Russian investigative journalist, Maxim Borodin, who wrote about the deaths of mercenaries in Syria, has died in hospital after falling from his 5th-floor flat.
Now, the conspiracy angle on this is that his apartment was apparently surrounded by security a day before he died, and a friend has claimed Borodin contacted him on the morning of the 11th of April, saying there was someone with a weapon on his balcony and people in camouflage and masks on the staircase landing.
Now, apparently the masked people were part of some drill, or at least Borodin claimed as much just before he died, but this isn't stopping people from suspecting foul play. The mysterious deaths of whistleblowers and investigative reporters are often fodder for deep state conspiracy theories, and reporters in Russia tend to have a much higher fatality rate than members of their profession overseas.
But if we ignore the Russian angle for just a second, people actually die mysteriously all the time. Now, friends report they did not think Borodin was suicidal, but that's no reliable indicator of mental health issues. What's interesting is that when people whose work we find interesting die, we sometimes search for answers as to why. For example, Uncle Quentin's death only becomes interesting when you consider just how many times he was kidnapped. But Aunt Fanny never kidnapped even once, hardly even got an obituary when she died.
You've been reading Famous Five books again, haven't you?
I sure have, and I've been tweeting those readings every Sunday at 5GoTweet.
That segment brought to you by M. Dentith and not the Enid Blyton estate.
And now, Nibiru. Apparently, we're all going to die on the 23rd of April this year.
Again?
Yes. Someone the Daily Mail described as a notorious biblical doomsayer, a person by the name of David Mead, no stranger to claims like these, I suppose that's why they're notorious, says the Book of Revelations, aka the Book of the Apocalypse, shows that the 23rd of April is the day for an end time, and an end time is to be had.
I'll mark it down in my diary.
You don't have a diary.
My point precisely. And so, we finish on Syria and our lack of coverage of the various conspiracy theories. Em, you are the mastermind of these news segments. What gives?
Well, Josh, we're saving Syria.
We're saving Syria! You heard it here first, folks.
We're saving Syria for next week, when we will devote an entire episode to the sordid incident.
Well, that's news to me, are we?
Yes, which provides proof positive you never read the script for the news update ahead of time.
That's true. Admittedly, you scripted this response.
I did.
And this one. I literally have no free will here. Even though you made me say that, you can make me say anything.
This isn't helping my rampant egomania, you know.
Well, stop making me say things like this.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
But in your defence, you've never made me say anything on these broadcasts that wasn't the God's honest truth, which is why I have to come clean about that event last September the authorities are still calling the Night of...
Moving right along, revaluing the Iraqi dinar and how you can benefit from a war in the Middle East.
Yeah, it's fine. And we're back. So this week's episode is kind of going to be a bit of a follow-up to last week's episode. Last week we talked about the storm and the mysterious Q or QAnon person behind it, this conspiracy theory that basically says all of the alt-right pro-Trump people's dreams are going to come true any day now. Now, no, not now, almost now. Oh, no, not quite. No, now. Now, oh, okay, tomorrow. Not tomorrow, probably the day after that. Well, maybe the day, I don't know, maybe sometime. It'll definitely happen.
Now, for those of you who didn't listen to last week's episode, and tut if you didn't, the QAnon or oncoming storm conspiracy theory is basically Donald Trump is playing 11-dimensional chess, is actually working for Robert Mueller to bring down the deep state, or working with the deep state to bring down the Russians and their allies in America, the Democrats. And frankly, Trump is not an aberration. Trump is simply pretending to be an aberration to get to the truly aberrant members of society, the Democrats. The thing to remember, it's the Democrats who are the real villains in this case.
But there's been more than one article pointing out that the basic form of this storm conspiracy theory is not something new. The QAnon storm whole affair is basically just the latest in a long line of these sort of prophetic cult/conspiracy theories that have been around for a very, very long time indeed. Now, a lot of these things that it has features in common with tend to be the more sort of religious types. There are plenty of cults or other, what would you call, organisations? So what's a more neutral term than cult? Or will cult do? I think cult
probably
will actually do. Yeah, there have been plenty of cults centered around these predictions that, in a religious sense, usually the end times are coming, the rapture is coming, the judgment day is coming any day now, just around the corner. And there, you can find plenty of stories online of people who are constantly predicting the end of the world and then having to update it when that date comes and the world mysteriously fails to end. You also get numerous ones in the more modern age around UFOs. That the benevolent aliens are coming to take us away, or I suppose the evil aliens are coming to destroy us all.
Or the government is about to release all the information about UFOs to the public, and it's actually just been delayed by a few weeks because of this thing or that thing.
You had the Heaven's Gate cult, who back in the late 90s actually put their money where their mouth was by committing mass suicide. When they believed that aliens hiding in the tail of the oncoming comet Hale-Bopp were about to take their spirits away to somewhere. That was quite. They still have a website apparently. If you go look for it, it's still up and still very 90s. But aside from, yes, as you say, the UFO ones where they'll invoke government conspiracies covering things up, the sort of religious-y ones don't get massively conspiratorial. But there are others that do. So we're going to look at a few of them. They sort of, you can kind of trace them from one to the other. As one conspiracy finishes, the remnants of that one will pick up a new one, and it essentially has the same theme. So
the same conspiratorial DNA, you might say.
You might indeed. So where to start? In fact, it gets a little bit murky because there does tend to be a little bit of crossover. We can start with either NESARA or the Omega Trust. They're kind of...
Well, NESARA and the Omega Trust are kind of, one bleeds into the other. We should start with NESARA.
Okay.
So NESARA is the National Economic Security and Recovery Act. This was a set of proposed monetary reforms put forward by this person by the name of Harvey Francis Barnard in his book Draining the Swamp. Now, of course, anyone who's paying any attention to the Trump administration or the presidential campaign which brought us the Trump administration will realize that draining the swamp is one of those operative words that conservatives or fiscal conservatives really do like. The idea that there's a morass of swampy individuals operating within the establishment, and most of them are there to basically feather their own nest. So we need to drain the swamp. remove money from the equation to make America great again. And Barnard basically wanted to abolish the Federal Reserve, ban interest on loans, forgive all consumer debt, establish a national sales tax, and go back to the gold standard. And going back to the gold standard is a bit of a conspiratorial trope within certain conservative circles on the notion that, what's wrong with America is the Federal Reserve, and the idea that the Federal Reserve basically took the marking or valuing of the American dollar away from the gold standard to a floating standard, and that things would be much better if people just hoarded gold or rare earth metals, as people like Glenn Beck or Alex Jones would tell us to do, because that's a true value apparently within the world.
So Mr. Barnard tried to get Congress to pass his NESARA Act, which they did not. This was, when did we say it was? Back in the 80s. So late 90s.
Late 90s. You're an entire decade out.
It's all the same.
But you've always been an entire decade out your entire life.
It's entirely true. Yes, you may notice that these sweeping reforms did not come in several decades ago. He did, however, publish the text of his proposed bill online, where it was found by a woman by the name of Shiny Goodwin. Shiny, perhaps? I
think it is Shiny.
Otherwise, Shiny would be a little bit too... We'd get bogged down in Firefly references. So, Ms. Goodwin was a promoter of Shill 4, would be the... more judgmental term, the Omega Trust. And this is something that had been going on before. This is where this sort of the crossover comes in a little bit. This is something that had been around, and then when she read about NESARA, she sort of pounced on that, and the two became amalgamated like one of those conspiracy amoebas that you always see in the streets these days.
You probably should talk to your optician or your psychiatrist.
Well, that's a different matter entirely. No, the Omega Trust was a trust that supposedly sold these Omega units of, quote, prime European banknotes, unquote, for relatively small amounts of money, as little as $100, which were supposedly going to roll over and return millions of dollars in profit. Obviously, this is nonsense. The whole thing was a scam, a vaguely sort of pyramid-y, Ponzi schemish sort of thing, just to milk money out of people.
A get-rich-quick scheme.
Yes, in the grand tradition of good get-rich schemes. So obviously, these profits failed to materialise eventually. Now, as we've talked about the whole prophetic thing, again, this is something that had sort of a time limit on it, or a promise of future riches. At some point this rollover is going to happen, and we'll all be rich beyond our wildest dreams. In much the same way that QAnon says, at some point there's going to be this counter coup that's going to get rid of everyone you hate and put everyone you love back into power, and it'll be amazing. So in August of 2000, the feds actually just came in and arrested a whole bunch of people. But that just fed into the conspiracy theory, of course, because now this shows the government's trying to stamp it out. They're trying to stop NESARA from happening. They're trying to kill this Omega Trust.
Now, I do feel here that you've skipped over an important point, that even before the NESARA angle came in, to explain why the profits were failing to materialize, the kind of excuses the people behind the Omega Trust came up with got weirder and weirder. So initially you had claims of renegade banks. So there are banks out there who are trying to stop this. They're going against the grain. And then it got slightly weirder with the claim that the US government didn't actually exist. So this is basically going, well, the US government isn't legitimate because it's farmed out its monetary policy to the Federal Reserve, which is a private institution. And then there were interventions from angels that were stopping these prophets from materializing. UFOs were stopping the prophets from materializing. And entities from alternate realities were also invoked as to why prophets were failing to roll into your bank account at any particular point in time.
Yes, right.
There were a lot of factors against the Omega Trust.
There were, yes. I should not have skipped over those. I was a little bit too keen to get to the conspiratorial motherlode, as it were, of 9/11, because as we said in August 2000 is when the feds first came in, and then just over a year later 9/11 happened. So supposedly the conspiracy theory then went that this new law, this rollover, this inaction of NESARA was going to happen at 10 a.m. on September the 11th, 2001, but then all the computers and data and all this stuff was destroyed on the second floor of one of the twin towers that were destroyed in New York City, but no one knew about it in advance due to a gag order from the Supreme Court. Damn them! So there you go. September 11 even was just all to cover up NESARA and to sneak a knife into the Omega Trust.
Basically, what was happening here was that when Goodwin basically got involved here, the idea was the reason why these Omega units were not turning profitable was that the profitability of an Omega unit was basically predicated on NESARA being successfully passed through Congress. So the best way to explain, well, you bought these units and they aren't providing the profits that we said they would do. But the reason is there's a particular law that needs to pass before they become profitable. And wouldn't you know it, dark, sinister powers operating at the edge of reality are stopping that law from being passed. And then, of course, 9/11 happens.
So at this stage, Ms. Goodwin had sort of set herself up as the sole source of information, the main prophet behind the whole thing. There were other people, but they eventually sort of fell by the wayside or got arrested or were in some other way miscommunicated as things did take on a vaguely sort of messianic religious feel to them. But the thing eventually just sort of petered out. Between about, 2007 and 2010, interest just kind of died out. Too many of the key figures had gotten arrested or convicted of various frauds and so on and so forth. And the Omega Trust and talk of NESARA just kind of faded away, but that just left room for another conspiracy theory to fill in the gaps.
Now, what's interesting about this particular conspiracy theory is just how wide the support base was. So you had people who were interested in UFOs, you had people who were interested in New Age cults, you had anti-Catholic conspiracy theorists, because Goodwin, now operating under the name of the Dove of Oneness, was making the claim that actually the Vatican and the Rockefellers, so you had both Catholics and a Jewish banking family, and for listeners at home, I put quotes around the whole Jewish banking thing, not to say the Rockefellers aren't Jewish, but to make
highlight the
connection to the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that often appear in these kind of financial furores. Trying to work out, I didn't want to say conspiracy theory twice there, but having to explain why I use furore, I've used conspiracy theory 4 times now. I'm basically just going to say conspiracy theory, conspiracy theory, conspiracy theory to really ram it home. So yes. And as social psychologist Mike Wood argues in a very interesting blog post on this, it's because basically Goodwin was tailoring her story to be receptive to a lot of very different audiences. So it was quite easy for people who were only interested in UFOs to skip over the whole anti-Catholic stuff. And it was quite easy for conservatives who are only concerned about where's my damn money to go, well, yeah, I don't really care about this UFO nonsense stuff. I just want to know, why is the government failing to pass NESARA? And so Goodwin was really good at messaging to make sure that different audiences were receptive to her tale to keep people basically on tenterhooks as to when they were going to get their goddamn money.
And of course, starting in the late 90s and moving on to the early 2000s, this was a scam, let's just call it that, a scam that came in, that sort of got in the ground floor of the internet pretty much. So it was able to spread as widely as it did due to the magic and wonder of the internet. But by the time it fiddled out, the internet was just everywhere, a part of our lives, to the point that as a technical writer in my day job, I was witness to discussions of do we stop capitalizing the word internet now that it's essentially a public amenity like electricity and water? Is it actually worth the capital letter, or is it just a part of our lives? But it is, quite frankly. Sorry.
So have we stopped capitalizing internet now?
It's still a style thing. You can if you want to, or not if you don't want to. But at any rate, by the 2010s, everybody was into it, and so the next theory that sort of basically filled the vacuum left behind by Nessara and the Omega Trust was able to spread like wildfire once more. And this theory involves the Iraqi dinar. Tell us about the Iraqi dinar, please, Em.
Well, the Iraqi dinar was and actually I think still is the currency of Iraq. And of course, in about 2003, the Iraqi dinar lost an awful lot of value. And that's because in 2003, the West decided to invade Iraq to stop Saddam Hussein producing those pesky weapons of mass destruction. Now, prior to the invasion, the dinar had actually traded for about as much as $3 per dinar, and that was largely pumped up by the policies of Saddam Hussein. But after the invasion, it crashed to the point where 1,000 dinars were worth $1. Now that's both number wang and also massive deflation.
Bit of Mitchell and Webb humour there for your listeners. We know what you like.
Now, some people claim that once Iraq was stable, Western string pulling would spike the dinar's value back to its original value, and thus wise buyers who bought dinars now would soon become instant millionaires. So basically, buy low, sell high, and don't care about the social costs. And that meant... Oh, yeah?
Sorry, no, you continue.
And that meant that tens of thousands of Americans then sunk millions into Iraqi dinars, hoping for what would turn out to be ludicrous returns.
Yes, now, as I was going to say, this is obviously nonsense. You don't just pump the value of a currency up 1,000-fold. It doesn't work like that, and if you did do that, it would cause massive financial chaos, basically. I mean, there have been cases where, such as Zimbabwe, I think it was, where they have massive hyperinflation, and so, by factors of thousands or millions, where the government has essentially just chopped a bunch of zeros off the ends of the currency just so that people don't have to deal with, only have to deal with thousands rather than millions, and then simply so that the numbers don't get ludicrous, but they didn't actually change the value of the currency. So this was, anyone with a little bit of financial literacy would know that this probably wasn't going to happen, but money-making scams are not targeted at people with large amounts of financial literacy, I suppose. They're targeted at people who could be swayed by claims such as that the American government had trillions and trillions in dinars stored up, so that people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, they'd been stocking up on dinars because they know they're going to be even more billionaire-ish than they are when all this rolls around. So when obviously in combination with A, the fact that it appears to be completely implausible, and B, the fact that obviously it hasn't happened yet, even though they keep saying it's going to happen, The claims as to why it hasn't happened yet, as we saw with Nisara and the Omega Trust, started getting more and more outlandish. People made references to these secret non-disclosure agreements having been signed, undiscovered mineral riches, supposedly secret government tax shelters set up for dinar windfalls. There were all these mysterious, secretive things swirling around that we, and this should sound familiar, that these people who are really in the know are all privy to, but the rest of the world, the poor sheeple that they are, won't have heard of.
So buy your dinars now.
Buy them today. So yes, this time, in this day and age, Twitter came into play. So there were, this went around on Twitter quite a bit. I didn't note down the hashtags. There were a couple of hashtags which of the sort that, unless you know what they're talking about, didn't really appear to be talking about much of anything. But they talk about, what was the acronym? It was RN or RA for roll, or RD, roll the dinar or something. There were little coded words, and people would try to spread them around on Twitter in an attempt to make this revalue. Oh, RV, of course.
See, I just want to break in here with the Clash's version of roll the dinar, roll the dinar. Cherie don't like it. Ooh, ooh. Roll the dinar, roll the dinar.
This is the worst
but I'm not going to.
best I've ever seen.
That's not true. You have seen worse.
Yeah, that's probably true, actually. Yeah. Yes, so...
Now, we should point out, this is a live theory. So, unlike the Omega Trust, where you can't really buy Omega units anymore, although I'm sure there's probably someone out there with a slip of paper on eBay that you can buy an Omega unit from, the Iraqi dinar theory is still live. So there are still people stocking up on dinar, waiting for the reevaluation to occur. Apparently it was meant to occur about March 13th of this year, but strangely enough, that revalue hasn't happened. Obviously, something is going on behind the scenes to stop the West from pulling those strings and pumping up the volume, baby. I mean, pumping up the value, baby.
But again, it's just around the corner. You just got to wait. It's going to be here any day now, which is what...
Maybe we should buy some dinar.
Maybe we should. Should we buy some with Bitcoin? Should we buy dinars with Bitcoins and then use those Bitcoins to buy dinars and then use those dinars to buy more Bitcoins? It can't fail.
Yes. Donate money to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy so we can buy Bitcoins and dinar and see whether we can ride the financial revolution.
Indeed. So yeah, it's a bit strange to see why it still exists, because you can see currency transactions like the Omega Trust with these magical Omega units that could be anything and that were claimed to be who the hell knows what. If people wouldn't the speculation alone be driving up the price of dinars? I suppose not, because not enough people are in on it and it's already so far in the hole. But yeah, it seems a little bit odd that this one managed to stick around, but maybe we shouldn't be surprised given what we've seen from the outlandish claims around Nisara and the sort of stuff that's been coming out with QAnon, the cryptic announcements and the frankly grasping at straws of the people who at this stage are fully invested. And what's the quote? There's a quote about this, and I forgot it entirely. Essentially along the lines of once you get so far into a scam like this, you become psychologically dependent upon it being true, and will therefore justify.
Yes, you're basically just trying to justify bad financial decisions in the past by hoping for a windfall in the future.
And at that point, you're basically doing the scammers' work for them.
Yeah.
So this is quite, it's interesting to look at. And then, although the Iraqi dinar one's still going on, it has in recent times been eclipsed by the storm. So having seen these, I mean, it seems fairly clear that we can draw a number of similarities between these ones and the QAnon ones, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you've got the existence of white hats who are leaking information, so insiders who are part of the system, leaking information to people who are in on the story, and often leaking that information in rather vague ways. So rather than directly stating what's going to happen next, they'll leave suggestive hints for wise people to decipher. So we saw that with the kind of quatrain-like way of presenting information in QAnon. You saw the same thing with Nasara, and we're still seeing the same thing with the Iraqi dinar. The way that the story is promoted to believers in the hypothesis is to say something very, very vague, but very suggestive that something is just about to happen, but not say it in a direct way where when it doesn't happen, people go, oh, well, that obviously didn't occur. A case of, oh, but it might have occurred. I mean, we saw that with QAnon. We talked about it last week. There was discussion that people like John Podesta, John McCain, and Barack Obama were going to be arrested. Now, they weren't publicly arrested, but they're all wearing pants. And because they're all wearing pants, and by pants, as New Zealanders, we are, of course, referring to trousers. Yes. Because they're all wearing trousers, that probably means they're hiding ankle bracelets. Because as we know, John McCain always sports jorts. But now he's a trouser man. Yes. And that means he's got an ankle bracelet. Dun, dun, dun.
Having been secretly arrested by secrets.
Yeah, and you get the same thing with the Iraqi dinar revalue hypothesis and Nasara. People who are being put forward as the villains of the piece then are claimed to have been secretly arrested at some point, which is why they are no longer a threat to Nasara being passed or the dinar being revalued. Although it turns out that these secret arrests don't seem to actually generate anything particularly useful for the hypothesis long term, but that's because there are other members of the deep state who are still working against you.
Now, of course, the one way in which the QAnon storm theories are a little bit different from these ones is that no one seems to be making money out of them, at least not yet. I mean, these other ones we've looked at are clear money-making scams. They're basically Ponzi scheme, pyramid scheme type things. Do you know what the original Ponzi scheme was?
I'm fairly sure it's some kind of Polish Fonzie scheme, which involved someone on water skis jumping over a shark in Krakow and making lots of money, but it all turned out to be fake.
You're almost right. It was to do with sort of international postage. It was an international postage scam in that it's sort of, I forget the details now. This is just an interesting aside because I found it interesting when I first found out about this. That it was to do with the fact that...
And it is also an aside.
You used to be able to get this sort of international postage order that could like be redeemed for stamps or something, and there was a way of... You could sort of post one of those and get it sent back to you and redeem it in other countries, and by manipulating exchange rates, you could actually make a small profit by simply buying something and then converting it at the other end. So the original Ponzi scheme did actually make money, but just a little bit of money, not the massive returns that Mr. Ponzi promised his investors. And so then when you got to the actual, what makes a Ponzi scheme, where you take the money that your earlier investors give you to pay these miraculous returns, your later investors give you to pay these miraculous returns to your earlier investors, which requires the whole pyramid type thing of more and more money coming in, and eventually it all collapses. But anyway, that certainly doesn't seem to be happening with the storm, at least yet. QAnon hasn't, as far as I'm aware, set up a Patreon or started claiming that you need to send in lots of money to pay for legal costs or who the hell knows what. Or even with the sort of religion doomsday culty ones, at least the cult leaders, presumably get something out of being the head of a cult. Usually sex stuff when it comes to the religious ones, but possibly just being worshipped and venerated is enough for many. But so far we haven't seen any attempt to monetize the storm yet, have we?
No, I mean, I can kind of see an emotional investment argument for the people who subscribe to the storm, in that if you're concerned about President Trump and you think that maybe he's a rotten egg, then the oncoming storm provides you with an emotional reassurance that actually it's not that bad. Trump's working with us, not against us. But that, of course, describes people's psychological attitude towards belief in the hypothesis. It doesn't really tell us anything about why QAnon is doing it, although, as we discussed last week, some people are of the firm opinion that QAnon is just a troll, that the entire system is not actually trying to generate or provide evidence of a conspiracy to bring down the deep state or work with the deep state against the Russians. It's someone simply trolling the kind of people who would believe that kind of hypothesis.
So rather than spreading conspiracy theories for easy cash or for sex orgies with sex cults and sexy sexiness, this person's spreading conspiracy theories just for the lols. I don't know if that makes it better or worse.
It's a moral grey area.
Different. Let's just say different. But interesting to talk about nonetheless.
Indeedy.
I think we've reached the end, though. I think we've come to the usual brand of non-conclusion. One usually
we've come to a jolly climax,
and jolly it was. But I think we are now spent. So it remains only for us to bask in the afterglow and tell you that you've been listening to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, recorded pan-dimensionally, pan-nationally, I suppose would be more accurate.
Internationally is the usual term, but let's binationally. Binationally, sell locally.
Yes, in both Auckland and Bucharest. I am the Auckland contingent. My name is Josh Addison. If you want to get in touch with me to send listener feedback of the type we were vaguely suggesting we hunger for at the start of this episode, you can send me feedback via Twitter, where my username is monkeyfluids, or you could leave us comments on the various sites where this podcast is hosted. You can leave reviews on iTunes. You can, I assume, do stuff on Stitcher as well. I haven't really paid much attention to that, to be honest. You can leave comments at conspiracism.podbean.com, which is the website where this podcast is hosted. You could also go on Facebook and search for the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, where you'll find our page. You could leave us feedback there. You could go on YouTube and search for the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, where you will find videos, video versions of these episodes, hopefully one for this episode as well, because it's worked out the last couple of times. So I think we've got our groove back. Any one of these methods could be used to get in touch with me specifically, or possibly you, Em. What are your deals?
Well, I can be found on the internet with the Twitter handle Conspiracism. You can also find me at my blog, episto.org, which is a bit barren these days because it just tends to be links to the podcast. I find I'm doing a lot more writing for publication, which is actually making it difficult to find time to do writing for the blog. If only I had a permanent position, that would make life much easier. So someone give me a long-term job. I bore of the precarity of short-term contracts as a researcher. What I want is a nice institution to call my own. But that's another matter entirely. So you can find me online, and you'll find information about this podcast there.
Yes, you will. And I suppose obviously the other thing is to cravenly beg for cash. If you go to conspiracism.podbean.com, you will find links to our patronage sites, both the native podbean.com malarkey. I don't quite know how you describe that, and also at patreon.com. There's a link to that from the podbean.com website, or I assume you can go on Patreon and just generally search for the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy there as well.
You should be able to, yes.
Yes, so a couple of bucks here and there help us pay our annual hosting fees and possibly up
and software licenses.
And software licenses, yep. The software that I've been using to record these video calls, which appears to be actually working now, so I've got a full license for it. And your money, noble donators, noble patrons, helped make that happen. So thank you very much. More, please.
Yes, lots more. We have so many licenses to buy. So many licenses.
Most of them non-pornographic.
Yes, most of them. Right,
so the less said the better. I think we've come to the end of an episode. So, unless you've any objections, I will say goodbye.
And I will sign off by saying I didn't kill anyone in Sofia. I don't care what the authorities are claiming.
Works for me. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
You've been listening to Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, hosted by Josh Edison and M. Dentith. If you'd like to help support us, please find details of our pledge drive at either Patreon or Podbean. If you'd like to get in contact with us, email us at podcastconspiracy@gmail.com.